Welcome to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast, addressing all aspects of the digital enterprise, inspiring connection without boundaries and creation without limits. Thank you for tuning in. Here are your hosts, Thom Singer and Craig Brown.
You are in the right place. This is the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. The Digital Enterprise Society is a forum for the exchange of ideas surrounding the tools, processes, and practices used across the product lifecycle. To learn more, visit digitalenterprisesociety.org. My name is Thom Singer, and I have the honor to co-host this show every week with Craig Brown, an industry veteran and former PLM leader at General Motors. But today's show has been repurposed from another podcast that I host called Making Waves at Sea Level. In this interview with Kate O'Neill, the tech humanist, we are going to expose you to some new, fresh ideas. Kate is very compelling and very smart, so we decided that we would like to take her outlook on tech, humanity, and careers and share it with the listeners of this show. Kate touches on many areas that will grab you, including where to start your discussions around digital transformation and how to always be advocating for the user and customer. We hope you enjoy this episode. All right, so Kate O'Neill, welcome to Making Waves at Sea Level.
Oh my gosh, after that, so much energy in your intro, I feel like I can just come rushing into the room with you. I'm so excited to be here.
So I just admire the work you do around technology and humanity, and I was trying to describe it, and I don't even know how to do that properly. So could you tell us a little bit about the work that you've done?
Yeah, sure. It's an organic evolution because I've been in the technology space for 25 years. I was in around software and e-commerce and all sorts of emerging technology in a lot of different roles. From building, I built the first content management role at Netflix as one of the first 100 employees there. I built the first intranet at Toshiba. And it was those were early days, so there were a lot of firsts. And what I found though over the years was that one of the characteristics of me in my work was that I was always thinking about the user, about the customer, and that I was always the person, even if it wasn't explicitly in my job title, I was the person who was an advocate for the user and the customer in all of our discussions. But that didn't mean that I wasn't trying to help the company be successful. Because to me, that was a both and proposition. It was always about how can we figure out what the company is trying to do and how it aligns with people outside the organization, and how can we make those objectives align. And so that follows directly into the work that I'm doing now. So as a speaker, as an advisor, as an author, what I'm exploring is data and emerging technology and how it impacts humanity and the human experience. But more specifically, because business is responsible for building most of that technology, how to make business incentives align with human objectives outside the organization. So a lot of that is just helping think about experience strategy and interaction design, but also thinking in big sort of broad abstract ways about ethics and privacy.
So before we got started recording, we were talking about certain companies in sort of the call it the digital video platform broadcast set, and some of them are very hard to figure out, and others of them are very user-friendly. How come some companies totally miss the mark that it's a person who has to use your technology, and if you don't make it work the way their brain works, they're going to just scream and throw things at the wall?
Yeah, there's this this tendency, I think, for us to center ourselves when we're creating solutions. I think that happens a lot in software design. I think it happens a lot everywhere, in fact. It's something that as a writer, you're constantly reminded not to do, that you want to be thinking about the reader. You want to be thinking about how to create an experience that's authentic and that you're saying something that's meaningful to you, but that also meaning is something that is shared. So it has to be a communication that makes sense to both you and the reader. And I think from a design standpoint, we have to think about not just what's going to make sense taxonomically and ontologically to the company. We don't necessarily want to use company vocabulary to describe the functions of a piece of software or of a website or e-commerce system. We want to be thinking about what people are trying to do. I have a funny kind of example of this, like early days at Netflix. We had just I think we just came away from using there was a early logo of the purple film reel that was Netflix's logo way back in like 98, I want to say. And so 99, 2000 time frame, they commissioned a big design firm to redo the brand logo. And they unveiled it at a big company meeting. We all got new business cards and new stationery and everything. And it was terrible. It was this weird rounded square box kind of design. And the back of the business card had this kind of like gray static imagery, and it was clearly meant to suggest like the TV, like you were watching your movies on the TV. And I think the designers thought that they were connoting the value of being at home, the convenience and comfort of being at home while you watch movies. But that's not what people were really trying to do. They were trying to watch movies. They were trying to have a movie experience. And so with the insights that sort of around two, I'm scrapping all of that and saying, all right, let's go back and figure out what is it that people are actually trying to experience here. They understood better that it was really about that sort of archetypal movie experience. And so then came the iconic sort of red ticket stub and red movie theater curtains sort of thing. And, there's a lot more of that imagery and iconography that's embedded in the brand history at this point over the last 20 some years. But it took that one failed effort of saying like, oh, let's go for what people really care about. And it's like, oh, no, that's what we care about. That's not what they care about. What they care about is the movie piece of the experience, not the at-home piece of the experience.
So I love how broad your work goes, because we started off talking about sort of the technology itself and how designers design. And we often see the world through our own eyes, no matter what we do. That's why, jargon and lingo happens, because we see things the way we see it and we assume, well, everybody knows that. I mean, we do that in the professional speaker world. Other people are like, what does that mean? Because we come up with our own language for how things happen at meetings and what we do. But I also like the way you took it back to look.
Like we care about the distinction between lectern and podium, and no one else
There's
does.
not a regular human being on the planet who would correct you for saying lectern or podium in the wrong way. And yet in our world, if you say, oh, I was up at the podium, they go, well, technically that would be a lectern. Yeah, that would be a lectern.
Actually.
So, but you took it all the way to logo design. So this is a very broad thing. This connection to humanity is very, very big. So let's go back to your early days at Netflix, because this was pre-streaming. This was when, why go to Blockbuster? We'll mail you the movies. What was that like? And you were up against a behemoth that was in every single strip mall on every single corner. What was that even like to work there?
Yeah, so I joined the company just as they were sunsetting the a la carte rental program, because they had just figured out the monthly subscription program, where it was like I joined as a customer when it was a la carte rental. And so many people don't realize that Netflix had that origin, that it was actually doing the rentals by mail one off, one at a time, instead of saying like you're paying 10 or 15 bucks or whatever a month and you can get 3 or 4 at a time.
And I want to interject there. The subscription model is now what everybody is looking for. But if you go back, 20 years, you're talking about 22 years. The subscription, what's a subscription model for a service?
Yeah.
That was not ubiquitous.
Yeah, and that's what convinced me to reach out to them, because I thought they really are onto something so smart and they've cracked this nut. So I sent my resume over and I just said, look, I don't know what you need, but I have a bunch of different skills and I'd be happy to use any of them for you. Just like figure something out for me and let me go. And so they did. They found me a role. I was the first ever content manager. It was a really fun role. It was this hybrid of database management and editorial. So a little bit, it's exactly like me, right? I'm a linguist by education, but I'm a technologist. And so I think a lot about these hybrid areas of language and communication and editorial and writing, but also about systems and architecture and how we kind of design the relationships between entities in the background and to make those accessible and create good user experiences. So it was really cool to be there in those early days, just after they discovered the subscription model, just as they were sunsetting this a la carte rental program, and the future looked really, really bright, except, as you say, it was the Blockbuster behemoth in the ecosystem, and we were like, that's who we're gonna we're going to fight them. We're going to get them. And what I think is really exciting, this being a show for C-suite leaders, I think this is the most inspiring piece of this entire story for me. And I bring this up a lot with my C-suite clients, that the fact that at that time, and this is like, I want to say 2000, that Reed Hastings, the CEO, is looking ahead and saying, you know what we need to do is not only win this DVD subscription war, we need to be prepared for what's coming in the next few years, the step beyond that. And so at that time, the discussion was all around set-top boxes. That was the discourse that we had for what would become streaming. But the predecessor to that was thinking about set-top boxes. So it was Roku and, its ilk, right? So this is in 2000, there's research and development money and effort being funneled set aside and put into research towards set-top boxes and current day streaming. And I just think that's profound, that in a time when you're by no means the leader in the space, you're this upstart who, is barely, you're still striving to get 1 million subscribers at that point. And you're saying, you know what, we're going to not only win against Blockbuster, but we're going to have the next thing after that. And it wasn't until 2006 that Roku came out as its own product. And it wasn't until 2007 that there was a dedicated streaming plan. So that's 6-7 years of horizon to be able to see as the visionary CEO, this is what we're going to invest in. This is where we're going to spend some resources and some effort on being sure we're ready to land when that thing comes. And that's why you see Netflix have the market dominance that it does, and why it has the brand presence and prestige that it does, is because they have been so ahead of it, and they have been such a leader in the space. The experience is strong. When you go in there, they were the ones that really got us binging. They were the ones who figured out the whole continue watching thing and just skipping right ahead to the next video and keeping you going. They have so many little tricks that they've embedded into the system, for better or worse, right? Like there's some bad things we could say about what that's done to us in our health and our culture. But I think that what you cannot say about that is that they haven't been leaders and haven't been visionaries. And so I think that that's incredibly inspiring.
There's two things I love about what you just shared with us. And the one is the Netflix story. Of course, we all know it. Blockbuster went away. Netflix came in. But I love the part where they were looking, hey, we're not just winning this battle. What's the next one? How do we get ahead to this desktop streaming? And then another piece of that is somewhere along the line, they said, let's create our own content. And they weren't the first non-movie studio to necessarily do that, but they were the first to really, you can say HBO, but HBO was a little different than Netflix. So for Netflix to make that leap, they really did a great job right out of the gate of saying, let's create our own content. And by the way, it's going to be great content. And so, again, that was thinking farther ahead than how do we just stream? It's how do we do this? And I think the story of Netflix is a great one, and it must have been cool in the early days to be around people who were thinking the way they were thinking.
Yeah, I think it was. And I also think that, what's become famous about Netflix from an organizational standpoint is that culture deck that Reed Hastings and Patty McCord put together. And that has gone on to shape the cultures of many, many Silicon Valley startups since, and beyond Silicon Valley, I'm sure. What I have to say about that is that it was very true, even before that deck was committed to pixels, I guess. It was very true. There were many cases in which, and in fact, Patty McCord guided me through a couple of difficult management decisions that I had to make, where I found myself in her office wringing my hands and going, Patty, help me. I don't know how to manage this situation. And her giving me very wise guidance. So there was a lot of great, strong leadership. But I think the thing that really makes Netflix such an interesting story on every level, organizationally, culturally, brand-wise, experientially, is that it always continued to have that focus on aligning the business objectives with the customer experience. And that piece, again, comes back fully to what I find myself doing, 20 some years later in my consulting and advising work and my speaking work, is trying to help leaders think about, even now with the big focus on digital transformation these days, through COVID and beyond COVID, a lot of it tends to start in this very tech-centric discussion. Leaders want to talk about what technology should we be investing in? What should our AI strategy be? What should our automation strategy be? And that's exactly the wrong place to start this discussion. It should 100% be about what your company exists to do and is trying to do at scale, and what the people that are outside your organization are trying to do with your company, and what they need, what their objectives are, and how they benefit from you making it easier to do what they're trying to do.
So I want to unpack that, but I have two things first. Yeah. One is I said there were two things about Netflix, your story. And so yeah. I don't want to skip where we're going, but the first thing I want to touch on is I want to make sure that everyone listening also picked up on the fact of the way you ended up at Netflix. You sort of right by that. And that was, they were making changes. They were looking forward. They were being thought leaders. They came up with this idea of let's trash this and put in this subscription model. And you said, wow, that looks interesting. So I reached out to them for a job. And I think that's something that both the executives who listen to this show and the people who want to grow their careers who listen to this show, that's a win on both sides. As an executive, is there someone creative, who's thinking, who's out of the box, who's saying, I see you and I want to be part of it? That's awesome. And then to the worker, the person is, do you see someone? Are you reaching out saying, is there a place for me in your organization? I want to touch on that really quick.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting that for me, and I don't hold myself at the same level of, Reed Hastings or his co-founder, Mark Randolph, but I think it's interesting that now there's a keynote event or an event that's happening at the end of the month where I'm keynoting the event and Mark Randolph is the other keynoter at the event. And it sort of feels like this really beautiful symmetry.
A pattern of circles, I call that, when everything comes back
around. Yeah, a pattern of circles. I like that. Yeah, it feels like a way in which, there's some closure, there's some lifting, some, elevation of just good ideas and good people. I'd like to compliment myself to think that I'm a good enough person that I have worked for this. So it's a nice thing to see that there's not only, of course, it's funny that there's two former Netflix employees keynoting one event that has nothing to do with Netflix, but that, our paths have crossed again and that there's, kind of this celebration in the industry for what has come through that place and through that pipeline. And yeah, I do think that there's something really valuable about the process of, having run my own companies. Whenever someone has been enthusiastic about what I'm trying to do, why not? And bring them into the fold, what can they do for me? What can I do for them? How can we, feed off of that energy and that enthusiasm? And how can they bring their ideas and knowledge and expertise? Or maybe it's not expertise yet. Maybe it's too young to be expertise, but what they want to be their expertise. How can we help cultivate them? How can we help shape them and send them on their way to go create that good things in the world?
I just thought that was an awesome piece of your story. And I wanted to make sure everybody heard that I saw they were doing cool things. I reached out, they created a position for me. That's a total win for everybody involved. So, and I think your work really helps companies shake things up and make a splash. And so you were talking about companies being able to look at not just the technology we use, but how is our product used? What is the problem we solve? And at scale, how are people using it to solve those problems? So let's dive into this work that you're doing, the new book that you're bringing out, et cetera.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about these last few years is that my work has been focused on this concept of tech humanism. That was the last book. My most recent book was called Tech Humanist. And that has been all about, there's sort of a three-pronged philosophy there. One is that human experiences are increasingly shaped by technology. And that second thing is that business is primarily what shapes technology. And then that also technology is primarily about business incentives, built around business incentives, but that we're going to be increasingly having our world shaped by it. So it's sort of a perfect little symmetry and like a three-point syllogism in a sense that once you start thinking about that and unpacking it, it sort of has all sorts of consequences and all sorts of implications for how experiences should be designed and how businesses should be building the incentives within their businesses. So that's been a very interesting phase of my work. But what's also been interesting in that is that, number one, it has brought up it already had within it an incredible amount of discussion of digital transformation. I present the idea of human-centric digital transformation within the book Tech Humanist. But I have found more and more, of course, through COVID, there's been an incredible interest in digital transformation. At the same time, there's been an interest in how to navigate rapidly changing landscapes and exponential change just in general. Because when you think about it, we're dealing with the changes that AI and a robotic process automation sort of landscape brings about to the future of work and the future of jobs and the future of the workplace. We're dealing with the exponential changes due to climate change and the climate catastrophe. We're dealing with geopolitical changes and, sort of these overall cultural movements, toward nationalism, autocracy, and so on. Like there's kind of these very interesting, intersecting and interconnected upheavals that are happening. Not to mention, there's so many others when you start unpacking it. So I think what a lot of people in leadership positions are feeling is we can deal with, I should say, of course, the pandemic, right? Like that, I had mentioned it, but that's another one of those exponential changes. And so I think what people in leadership positions are often feeling is we can deal with one of these things. We could maybe sort of see our way through to building a roadmap that anticipates how do we have the right resources in place to deal with change at one kind of exponential scale. But what about when there's intersecting exponential scales? And that is what I'm finding to be a very interesting need to unpack with leaders. So I've developed,
so how do companies deal with this? Because you listed off like 4 or 5, serious rapid changes that are happening in our society that directly impact business. But there's a lot of them.
Yes.
That's a lot of things going on, Kate.
It is a lot of things. It's a lot of things. So what I've found is there's a model that I've built, and it's a model that has helped me personally get through changes in my own life, but that I've had, surely this more personally reflective philosophical model doesn't have any relevance on a business leadership level, but it does actually. And the more I've tested it and the more I've applied it in a sort of rigorous way, it has incredible applicability. So I've developed this model of strategic optimism. And it's the idea that, strategy, there's this kind of cliche phrase that hope is not a strategy, which it is not. It's true that hope by itself is not a strategy. However, pessimism isn't a strategy either. And so hope at least tells you what you're trying for. Hope gives you some idea of the direction you are trying to move in. And so it may not be a strategy, but it is a clue about what your strategy should be. And so I feel like there's this way in which hope or optimism in general and strategy sort of have a natural interplay. And I think once we recognize what the levers between them are and how we actually use one to inform the other and how we can take a look at the future that is optimistic, but informed by insights, and informed by data, and informed by real world factual knowledge. And we have a full picture of all the possibilities that are in front of us, then we choose to move in the most optimistic direction that aligns with what our strategy is. That's the approach. And I think I'm finding that it's resonating with some of the biggest clients that I work with, as well as some of the smallest. And it's very human.
It feels very human. And I love the term strategic optimism. But as you were talking, I was kind of running pessimism and optimism through the filter of my brain. And one of the things I realized is those who traditionally have moved us forward have been those who have been optimistic. Churchill came to mind in the fact that it was pretty bleak for England during the 1940s and during the war. And yet Churchill always told the people they would overcome. They were being bombed. They were living in the subway stations at night. It must have sucked. And yet he always had this attitude in his speeches and the things he said of optimism. And so that was one of the first things that came to my mind. And then the second thing that came to my mind was entrepreneurs who have changed the world, like, Gates or Jobs, or we could make the list extremely long, your friends at Netflix. they had to be optimistic to be able to do that, because you're essentially changing the way people are going to behave, the way they're going to go off of, purchasing a product or introducing new products. And so the true change makers of our society have almost always, I'm sure someone will come back and go, no, Tom, here's the negative pessimist who did that. Yes, there are outliers everywhere. But if you really start looking, the people who've made great changes and who have saved and recreated society over centuries have always been optimists, right?
Yeah, I think so. But I think there are people who have pushed back on optimism because they feel like, well, number one, it feels like it's a tool of the naive, it's folly, or that I think one of the more legitimate criticisms of optimism that I've gotten since I began putting this concept out there is that it is scorned for willfully ignoring real world harms. And I think that's a legitimate criticism, but what I find is that what my model is supposed to do is actually acknowledge those harms.
By putting strategy with optimism,
exactly.
Doesn't it solve that problem just by nature of the two words?
100% why I describe myself as an optimistic futurist, but I always have to have that little caveat in there. It has to be strategic optimism. It has to be a very clear-eyed understanding of, and like a survey of the real landscape and what the real situation is. So clear-eyed, inclusive, and as aligned with success as possible and as achievable as possible. Doing it that way is almost a guarantee of success. It's at least a guarantee that you're going to do better than you would have done if you had dwelt in the land of negativity or of sadness,
So as we wrap this up, and I know the book won't be out for a little while, but what tips do you have around strategic optimism that you can give business leaders, maybe one or two, that they could put into play today?
Yeah, I love this. One of the things that I did an article, actually if you look for it, you can find an article a while back on American Express Open about optimism in leadership. And one of the tips that I had shared there was, and I was quoted in it, I didn't write it, I just want to be clear. And so one of the tips I had shared there was, I think we deal a lot in what could go wrong, and that's very smart to do that. Whenever we start a new project or launch a new brand or program, we think a lot about what could go wrong and we build contingencies around that. What we don't do often enough is think about what could go right, and we don't necessarily build contingencies for that. And what I think the loss there is that we don't think about what happens, number one, if things go wildly right and you haven't built the scale to be able to deal with it. So we've seen many of those kinds of situations in Silicon Valley and startups where, you put something out there and then there's just too much demand, there's too much uptake of it, and then it shuts down the servers or something like that. That's a good thing. It's a world-class problem to have, but it's not a good thing for the people who are trying to experience this thing that you're excited to have them experience. So one of the things that you can actually do is have your team think about, like, what if this succeeds beyond our wildest dreams? Like, how do we make sure that we're setting ourselves up for success at that level? And then also you get to think about things like, what if it goes well and we get to think about the next step beyond that? And then you're starting to move yourself in a direction that almost ensures that that's where you're going to go.
God, I wish my brain worked like yours does. I've taken notes just from the standpoint of my own career. I've taken notes around, this whole idea of strategic optimism and things like, obviously I have to quote you, but, what you said for one of my clients is exactly what the client needs to hear. And I'm like, I wish my brain had just thought of that on its own, but that's absolutely
perfect.
I'm
so glad. I'm so glad it's relevant.
So Kate, we could talk for hours, and we have before, but if somebody's listening to this and they're like, yeah, I need to know about more of Kate O'Neill, how do they find you?
koinsights.com is my company website.
Which is also cool because it's like a double entendre, because it's like knockout insights. I like the KO insights. I dig that.
When I first set it up, someone asked me, was it all about the knockout or something? And I was like, what? I didn't even catch
I thought you knew that when you named it.
No. But now I can
like it. Yeah.
Pretend I can play
never after the last place you ever say it is on this spot. Never tell anybody ever again that wasn't the plan. Oh yeah, it's a double.
I'm way too
double
honest.
entendre, baby, all the way.
I'm way too honest not to own up to that. No, koinsights.com is the company website. You can also find me on Twitter, where I'm prolific, at Kate O. Of course, on all the social media, including Clubhouse. We're increasingly spending our time there. I see you there a lot, Tom.
Yeah, Clubhouse has been interesting. I've been telling people that it's put the social back in social media, because I have met more people. I have had more people on my podcast because I've listened to really smart things they've said. I mean, you and I have been friends for years, but I saw you on Clubhouse and I'm like, I need to have her on the podcast. So I've found a very social element to it. I also know from having been involved in social media for a long time that this too will jump the shark at some point.
Yeah. Well, everybody's all excited about Twitter Spaces, and I think that does make a lot of sense. There's an interesting way that could build into platforms we've already built out, and the taxonomies of our interests and so on. So that could be cool. But yeah, I'm all of those social media. You will find me, and you will find me at my website. There's also some great stuff coming out there about articles and blogs that I'm writing that are leading up to the new book. So if you're interested in that strategic optimism, the book is called A Future So Bright. And that will be, I hope, out about third or fourth quarter this year. I don't have an exact date
Awesome.
yet.
Well, Kate, your future is so bright. I have to wear shades while I'm doing this interview. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to everybody who tuned in and listened. I say it every episode, but it is so true. If it wasn't for the audience, why would we even do the show? So this is all for you. I did say at the beginning, it's like my own personal college, but I love to share it with everybody. And if you like the show and you listened this far, make sure you tell a friend about it. When I talk to people who listen, I say, how did you ever find my podcast? And they're like, my mother, my brother, my boss, my friend, somebody told them about it. So word of mouth is the most powerful tool that's out there. But don't get me wrong, I'd love it if you'd go over to Apple Podcasts and leave a review. We hope you enjoyed that interview with Kate O'Neill, the tech humanist. And remember, come back here every single week for more episodes full of thoughts, ideas, and information in and around product lifecycle management. The Digital Enterprise Society is the place for the exchange of ideas around digital manufacturing tools. Go check us out at digitalenterprisesociety.org.
You've been listening to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Learn more about what you've heard here today at digitalenterprisesociety.org. Join us again next week for more connection without boundaries and creation without limits.